So, good evening. It's supposed to be January 21st, 2025. We recorded on that day. And then look back in post, and the audio was all over the place wrong. So, this is January 21st, 2025 in the series. However, it's January 24th in real time. Yes? Fun. But we're continuing our discussion collection in our Outside the Class series. This series, from the Bible Project, it covers the entire TaNaK, right? That Old Testament. On TheDustyFeet.com, in the Outside the Class section, we have all of those source videos are set up for your review. Because the intent of Outside the Class, if you to listen to that in-class lecture first, right? The speaker, yeah? The lectures, they can all be found in that source video playlist because we want to keep these discussions to about 15 minutes. We want to make them easy to catch up on. So we're on a quest, scroll by scroll, book by book, a journey through this collection, but with a fun and maybe different twist on Outside the Class, on the Dusty Feet. And before we forget, if you do find these kinds of podcasts useful, you can click the subscribe button. Those reminders, they just help you. But also, if you think these might be useful to others, that's when you click that like button, because it is how YouTube chooses to share these to more people if they wish. So in this series, like we said, we're going to cover the entire TaNaK, right? That Old Testament. But we're going to do it in the original order of this collection, the Hebrew Scriptures order. So as we pass the first 5, things could get interesting. Remember that the videos we're going to be discussing, they're always just the tip of an iceberg. They are part of a learning series that I highly recommend, and those can all be found on the Bible Project website. Because we're going to ask many questions about all kinds of things. Answers? We'll see. Judges, Shoftim, this is our part 1. So I really do hope you gave the video a listen because it's a great launching point. Because Tim opens with an excellent point. Joshua was reminding them to obey the Torah. And then this happened, right? That's the story. And remember, we're just talking about promises. God is faithful in all of his promises, right? It's for us to remember God's promises are, if you do, then this. That's how his promises work. If you don't, then this. The Torah is merely the choice made. So again, I'm not compelled that God's son would turn around and say, well, what was that deal with my father was before? How did that work out? So it's going to be different for y'all. Just to ponder. So part of that thinking works when we're in this particular scroll of the Judges, right? Because like Tim said, this is a disturbing book. It's not a book generally discussed in pulpit conversations. It's full of very uncomfortable situations. And yes, sometimes we do take little snippets from it to make us feel good. But the truth is that this book, this scroll, right, is designed to not make us feel good. Just like we finished with Joshua, we're in the land. Joshua's died, like Moses did at the beginning of Joshua, But now, again, new leadership is installed. These different tribes are now set to occupy their actual spaces in the land. So the biggies are 2 of the most prominent clans that start this, right? All of the 12, the 2 big, Judah and Simeon. So we do get to see more of what happens as they push forward further into the land, right? Many of the tribes, we see they start to occupy their promised space. That this reminds us again of the practices used in the beginning, right? These people groups, the Canaanites are the overarching. Remember that. But we've talked about the bigger picture, right? Because within it are several subgroups under those Canaanites. And let's just say of those people groups in that, some are worse than others. But as Tim said, it introduces what the land looks like, and then what it looks like afterwards with us. Yeah, I said us, occupying the land. Because it intrigues me. This is the cycle through which we see things, right? We see sin, we see oppression, we see repentance, we see deliverance, and we see peace. Think about it. So I'll give you a couple of points that come to my mind, right? This seems like a good time to discuss maybe the story's purpose. Because if this is just a history book, it really isn't very good. I mean, the adage doesn't make sense in the victor's history, right? Victorious people wrote about how they got there from their perspective. But somebody didn't get the memo if this is their history book, because it does not portray the victor in a victorious light. Yeah. So as we begin this peek into the scroll of Judges, we have a brutal look into ourselves, right? You understand? This is the victor that's writing about themselves. I do agree. This is a look back, right? This is not an in the moment, right? This is not somebody pinning down what's happening at the battle of so-and-so at the moment. This is a look back into what happened. And it gets us caught up to wherever the author is at their moment, at their point in their history. It's him looking back from where he's at. So as much as we need to remember that the people in our people groups who listen to this that we're talking about, right, all around the globe, because most of my analogies are based on what's happening in my life, in my culture, in my experiences, in my time. Yeah. Because Tim pointed out something he said it in the very beginning. He said this was a warning. This is disturbing. It's violent. It's a tragic tale about Israel becoming Canaanites. Becoming what you don't want to be. Funny, all it takes is a little glance over our shoulders in America, and we go back to our beginning ways, and we paint ourselves in a very good light versus later on. We actually got a little better at a more brutal look back into that not friendly part of being a victor. But one could ask, have we become what we were running away from in our founding days? It's a brutal question. It's a look in the mirror question. It's one of those things that always causes me to look at scrolls like these in a more compassionate light. Becoming what you don't want to be. Either way, you're fleeing or you're jumping into something. Kind of works in both examples. See what they do here, right? Tim reminds us of points that are very important to our direction, right? The challenging part about God's appointment of people. It's an intriguing question. It is a challenging question. It's a real question. But it's uncomfortable the more you ponder it, right? God's choice of people. How do we see God choosing people? Because this question challenges our thoughts as we read this scroll and many scrolls going forward. Yeah, I like this uncomfortable thought. Because God chooses these people. Because I know with time, we've encountered leaders in our lives, and I'll use the ones in just the religious community, not other leaders. Just look at our own. And throughout lives, they've exhibited some attributes of let's say less than a leader of God. So in this series of episodes on the scroll of Judges, we're going to discuss each of these leaders. Some of the looks are going to be a little longer, some a little shorter, but we're going to take a look. Oh, wait, there's another thing I haven't mentioned yet. Maybe these scrolls also in their perspective can be viewed as a cautionary tale. The reason to look at them and say, hey, we don't want to repeat that. Because we understand the promise and the blessings that go with the promise. And we're now keenly aware that when we don't obey the instructions and the promises that follow, that is how this story is. It is. All the scrolls that we go through show what happens when some are good and others are not, responding to God's call and living through God's promises. Yeah. And for fun, let's also remember that we have God's instructions, right, in the Torah. We all get that. But here we also have instructions on what he wants them to actually do. He gives them a little detail in the land. He wants them to remove everything that, as Tim put it, walked the way of moral corruption. That included, in that list, child sacrifice. Yeah. So I find when we read this book, and again, I read this book with much caution, that you think about God's instructions. Think about that and then some. And as God said, push them out of the land. And everything that causes their practices to be part of that land, remove it. And then we, yes, again, I said we love to do the and then some, okay? And just remind us, give us a glimpse into what that could be on this scale, the scroll of Judges. And just listen to this part. This isn't Judges. This is just in chapter 1, okay? Now it came about after the death of Joshua that the sons of Israel inquired of the Lord, who shall go up for us against the Canaanites? Who will fight against them? And the Lord said, Judah shall go up. Behold, I have given the land into his hand. Then Judah, he said to Simeon his brother, come up with me into the territory allotted me, that we may fight against these Canaanites. And I, in turn, will go with you into the territory that's allotted you. So Simeon went with him. Judah went up, and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hands, and they defeated 10,000 men at Bezek. They found Adonai-Bezek in Bezek, and they fought against him, and they defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. But Adonai-Bezek fled. They pursued him. They caught him. They cut off his thumbs and big toes. Adonai-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off used to gather up scraps under my table. As I have done, so God has repaid me. So they brought him up to Jerusalem, and he died there. So here's the thing. Maybe it's too early, as it's a poor pun, but even this early in the scroll of Judges, we're off on the wrong foot. Or at least, in Adonai-Bezek's opinion anyways. Because I heard something challenging that just came to mind. I'm unsure if it fits here. Let me see. Because I think it's from a line, I think it's Spider-Man. Don't holler at me if I'm wrong, please. But here's the point. With great power comes great responsibility. Although that's probably not even an accurate quote, the point remains. With power comes responsibility. And I think we see here that God gave them some authority, even helped them with their win and their actions. Oh, wait, our actions. But it leaves us with a pretty poor display of how we should use that power and authority. Tim mentioned later in the video, and I think it's worth mentioning here, as we go through each episode in this scroll of Judges, we need to remember the phrase that's appropriate then. Might makes right. If I'm the victor, then I get to decide what's right. So I think we see this throughout the scroll of the Judges, where we have people in these positions and what they do in those positions. And it's scary when you pick up a mirror, isn't it? Right? Because we're going to see the same thing in our lifetimes. Oh, and secular government, I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about church history. Okay, so to close this episode, let's examine the mess that can result from not listening to instructions. This is just the beginning of Judges. We're towards the end of chapter 1. But Manasseh did not take possession of Bethshan and its villages, or TaNaK and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Iblim and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages. So the Canaanites persisted living in the land. And it came about when Israel became strong that they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but they did not drive them out completely. Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who were living in Gezer, so the Canaanites lived in Gezer among them. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron, nor the inhabitants of Nahalol, so the Canaanites lived among them and became subject to forced labor. Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Akko, or the inhabitants of Sidon, or of Ahalab, or of Aksib, or of Helba, or of Aphik, or of Rehob. So the Asherites lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, and they did not drive them out. Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh, or the inhabitants of Beth Anath, but lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land. And the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh and Beth Anath became forced labor for them. Then the Amorites forced the sons of Dan into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down into the valley. Yet the Amorites persisted in living in Mount Heres, in Ajaron, and in Shalbim. But when the power of the house of Joseph grew strong, then they became forced labor. The border of the Amorites ran from the ascent of Akrim, from Salah, and upward. Now a messenger of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said, I brought you up out of Egypt, and led you into the land which I have sworn to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And as for you, you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall tear down their altars, but you've not obeyed me. What is this that you've done? Therefore, I also said, I will not drive them out before you, for they will become as thorns in your sides, and their gods they will snare you. When the messenger of the Lord spoke these words to all the sons of Israel, the people lifted up their voices and wept. So they named that place Bochim, and there they sacrificed to the Lord. It seems that messenger, some folks get it in their scripture as angel, right? He made a trip, deliver some news. It seems there was a walk. Probably more to ponder there. But this theme of messengers, proclamation, repentance. Remember, we're going to see this pattern more than we care to think about. I'm not unsure that it still happens today, more than we care to think about. So next week, we're going to begin our investigation of these judges and some lessons to be learned, not to chastise, but as a cautionary tale for ourselves. So, thanks for being with us tonight on another episode of Outside the Class, as we did it again on the Dusty Feet.